We're going to talk about populism, the very first part of the progressive era. And our essential question is, how did farmers respond to the problems they faced in the late 19th century? Today, less than 2% of Americans live on farms. However, conditions were quite different in the 1870s, when a majority of Americans still lived on farms. The problems of farmers. In the late 19th century, the extension of farming to the Great Plains and the greater use of machinery and fertilizer led to an abundance of crops. Farmers experienced increasing difficulties as food prices began to drop, while their own expenses remained high. For example, the price a farmer received for a bushel of corn went from 66 cents in 1866 to as low as 10 cents in 1889. There were four main problems that farmers faced. 1. Agricultural overproduction. The opening of the West greatly increased the amount of land cultivated. Machinery and improved farming techniques increased productivity per acre. As farmers produced more crops, food prices fell. 2. High costs. Farmers had to ship their crops to market and were forced to pay whatever railroads charged. Railroads often took advantage of the lack of competition on local routes by charging higher rates for shorter distances. 3. Farmer indebtedness. Farmers often borrowed to make improvements or to buy machinery. During a poor harvest, farmers also borrowed, using their farm as security. Banks viewed farmers as poor credit risks and charged them very high interest rates. And 4. Periodic natural disasters. Farmers were subject to droughts, insect invasions, and floods. One bad year to their crops could wipe out a family's savings for a good many years. The Grange Movement. In 1867, the Grange Movement was founded. Its original purpose was to serve as a social club for farmers to help them overcome rural isolation and to spread information about new farming techniques. Within 10 years, the Grangers had 1.5 million members and began urging economic and political reforms. Granger Cooperatives. Grangers tried to eliminate middlemen by forming farmers' cooperatives to buy machinery, fertilizers, and manufactured goods in large numbers at a discount. The cooperatives also sold their crops directly to city markets. Unfortunately, because of a lack of business expertise, many of the Granger cooperatives failed. New Granger laws. Farmers mainly blamed the railroads for their difficulties. They felt they were being overcharged by railroads and by grain storage operators. In several Midwestern states, Grangers elected candidates to state legislatures who promised reform. These states passed laws regulating railroad and grain storage rates. In Munn v. Illinois in 1877, the Supreme Court upheld the right of a state to regulate businesses that affected the public interest within that state. However, in 1886, the Supreme Court reversed itself in a case involving the state regulation of railroad rates. The court ruled that only Congress could regulate rates on interstate commerce. This decision ended the state regulation of railroads. The Grangers then turned their attention to Congress for help. The Interstate Commerce Act, which we learned about in the last unit, prohibited railroads from charging more for short hauls than for long hauls over the exact same route. The Interstate Commerce Commission, created to investigate complaints and to enforce the act, was the very first federal government agency to regulate unfair business practices. These new regulations marked a change from the laissez-faire economy of the past. And finally, the Populist Party, 1891 to 1896. In 1892, farmers gave their support to the Populist Party, a new national political party representing the common man, farmers, industrial workers, and miners, in the battle against banking and railroad interests. Women played a prominent role in the populist movement, as both speakers and organizers. The Populist Platform. Populists were convinced the rich industrialists and bankers had a strong hold on government. Like the Grangers before them, the Populists wanted government to take a larger role, ending oppression, injustice, and poverty. In 1892, the Populists held a national convention in Omaha, Nebraska, where they chose a presidential candidate. They also drew up a party platform that had several innovative proposals. These proposals included unlimited coinage of silver to raise farm prices and make loan repayments easier, direct election of senators instead of by state legislatures, term limits for president permitting only a single term in office, secret ballots to protect voters from intimidation, government ownership of railroads, telegraphs, and telephones, a graduated income tax to tax wealthy individuals at a higher rate, immigration restrictions with quotas, and a shorter workday of only 8 hours. Election campaigns. With strong support in the South and the Northwest and the Mountain States, the populists turned their attention to getting candidates elected to office. The election of 1892, the populists elected 5 senators and received over 1 million votes for their presidential candidate. Soon afterward, the economy collapsed in the Depression of 1893. Populists blamed the Depression on the scarcity of currency. They demanded the unlimited coinage of silver to raise prices. In the election of 1896, the Democratic Party nominated William Jennings Bryan for president after he delivered a speech at the convention. His Cross of Gold speech praised farmers and denounced bankers for crucifying mankind on a cross of gold. The Populist Party supported Bryan instead of running another candidate. Bryan's sense of moral outrage, however, frightened many voters. He narrowly lost the election to Republican William McKinley, a pro-business candidate supported by wealthy Ohio businessman Mark Hanna. The country divided regionally. Bryan won the South and West, but McKinley won the Northeast and Midwest, and with it, the election.
I come to speak to you in the defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. Mr. Carlyle said in 1878 that this was a struggle between the idle holders of idle capital and the struggling masses who produce the wealth and pay the taxes of the country. They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country. We care not upon what line the battle is fought. If they say bimetallism is good, but that we cannot have it until other nations help us, we reply that instead of having a gold standard, because England has, we will restore bimetallism, and then let England have bimetallism because the United States has. If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. William Jennings Bryan.
In the election of 1900, 4 years later, Bryan again ran against McKinley. When McKinley won a second time, this virtually brought an end to the Populist Party. New gold discoveries, higher farm prices, and rural migration to the cities weakened national interest in a separate farmers' party in later years. The legacy of populism. The role of third parties. The Populist Party appeared suddenly in the 1890s and disappeared just as quickly, yet it left its mark on American history. Third parties often have an impact on political process. They provide an outlet for minorities to voice grievances and to generate new ideas. In this sense, the populists were typical of a third-party movement in the United States. Many populist proposals, such as a graduated income tax and the direct election of senators, were later adopted by one of the larger political parties. If a third party attracts significant numbers of voters, one of the major parties will often adopt its ideas. The best evidence of the influence of third parties is that so many of their proposals have passed into law.